What happens when a king finally traps Alexander the Great with nowhere left to run? At Issus, Darius III believed he had done the impossible. He moved behind the Macedonian army, cut off its retreat, and pinned it between sea, mountain, and a wall of Persian troops. By every ordinary rule of war, Alexander should have been finished, outnumbered, boxed in, one wrong move away from total destruction. But Issus became something far more terrifying than a Persian victory. It became the moment a perfect trap turned into a death sentence for the empire that built it. How did a king with a larger army, the stronger resources, and the better position end up handing the battle away? How did Alexander turn a closing cage into a killing ground? And why did one decision by Darius transform Persian strength into Persian suffocation? This is not just the story of a battle. It is the story of a hunter who thought he had cornered prey and discovered too late that he had cornered a predator. In 334 BC, the 21-year-old Alexander crossed the Hellespont and carried the Macedonian war machine into Asia. At the Granicus River, he smashed Persia's first defensive line and opened the road forward. But that victory solved only the smallest part of the problem. The real danger was still alive, and it was floating on the sea. Persia controlled a massive navy that dominated the eastern Mediterranean. If Alexander pushed too deep inland, that fleet could cut his supply lines, sever his contact with Greece, and leave his army stranded far from home. Persia would not need to defeat him in open battle. It could let distance, hunger, and isolation do the killing. So Alexander chose a colder answer. He refused to challenge Persia where it was strongest. He would not chase naval glory. He would not build a grand fleet and fight ship against ship. Instead, he decided to suffocate Persian sea power from the land. His solution was harsh and methodical. Move down the coastline and strip Persia of every harbor that kept its navy alive. From Miletus to Halicarnassus, Alexander did not have to destroy the fleet itself. He only had to take away the ports, the supply points, and the safe anchorages that made the fleet dangerous. Persia answered with its most dangerous counterstroke. It deployed Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary commander with a sharp strategic mind and a clear understanding of Alexander's vulnerability. Memnon sailed into the Aegean, seized islands such as Chios and Lesbos, and threatened to carry the war back toward Greece. If that plan succeeded, Alexander might be forced to turn around. But then the campaign took a brutal turn of fate. Just as Memnon's strategy began to take shape, he died suddenly from illness. That death shattered Persia's best chance to reverse the war. Alexander gained precious time. Darius III, without fully grasping it yet, had lost the most dangerous brain on his side. 18 months into the campaign, Alexander had driven through Cilicia and was preparing to cross the Nur Mountains into Syria. At last, Darius could no longer remain still. He marched out in person with a massive royal army. But instead of blocking Alexander directly, Darius made it a far more dramatic move. He slipped behind the Macedonian army and appeared in its rear, near the narrow coastal zone of Issus. In one stroke, Alexander's retreat was cut off. He was trapped. At least, that is what Darius believed. What he did not realize was that by closing the door on Alexander, he had locked himself inside the same space with a far more dangerous enemy. Darius reached Issus with everything that should have guaranteed victory: an enormous army, the elite immortals, and some of the finest cavalry in the world. On paper, the balance looked overwhelming. In reality, he had already begun to destroy his own advantage, because in his effort to catch Alexander from behind, Darius chose one of the worst battlefields imaginable for a giant army. Issus was a narrow strip of land, hemmed in by the sea on one side and steep mountains on the other. It was not a place for a massive imperial force to spread, maneuver, or crush an enemy with numbers. It was a funnel, and Darius had packed his own army into it. The result was brutal. His huge numerical superiority could not breathe. His formations had no room to widen. His troops could not fully deploy. The very weight that should have overwhelmed Macedonia became compressed, restricted, and far less useful than it should have been. At Issus, the battle stopped being about who had more men. It became about who could weaponize space better. Darius still tried to organize the field as best he could. He massed his strongest cavalry near the coast, where the flatter ground gave horses some room to operate. In the center, he placed his Greek mercenaries, the hardest infantry available to him. Persian infantry filled the left. Behind the small Pinarus River, the Persian king waited, convinced he had arranged a deadly reception. But Alexander read the field differently. He saw at once that this battle would not be won by matching Persian numbers. It would be won by choosing the exact point where pressure could break the enemy line. On the Macedonian left by the sea, he placed Parmenion and ordered him to hold. In the center stood the phalanx, still the iron spine of his army. On the right, near the foothills, Alexander concentrated his most dangerous troops, the Agrianian javelin men, archers, hypaspists, and the companion cavalry. Then, before the battle had even fully begun, he made another critical adjustment. He saw Persian pressure building hard against Parmenion's side, so he quickly sent the Salian cavalry across to reinforce the threatened wing. It was a small move compared with the violence that would follow, but it revealed something crucial. Alexander was not simply charging toward battle. He was already reshaping it. Both armies now faced each other across the river. Darius had more men. Alexander had less space to waste and less time to fail. Then the silence ended. When the fighting began, it did not begin gently. Alexander drove forward on the right with speed and shock, smashing into the Persian line with the companion cavalry and pushing the enemy back. It was the kind of attack that could make a commander believe victory was already opening in front of him. But while Alexander was tearing into one side of the battle, the center was drifting toward disaster. The Macedonian phalanx, trying to keep pace with the speed of the attack, became stretched and disordered. Gaps began to form. The machine that normally advanced like a wall of iron started to lose shape. Darius's Greek mercenaries saw it immediately. They struck hard into the opening and began driving into the Macedonian center. Suddenly, the battle stood on the edge of catastrophe. If the center broke, the entire Macedonian line would be split apart. Alexander's brilliant assault on the right would turn into an exposed thrust with no secure army behind it. He could be isolated, surrounded, and crushed. That was the deadly hinge of Issus. One more failure in the center, and everything might collapse. Many commanders would have kept chasing momentum. They would have pushed harder for visible glory and trusted the rest of the field to survive. Alexander did the opposite. The moment he recognized the danger, he abandoned the temptation to keep driving forward blindly. He gathered the companion cavalry, wheeled sharply inward, and slammed into the flank of the Greek mercenaries in the Persian center. That turn changed the battle. The mercenaries, hit from the side, lost cohesion. Their assault stalled. The pressure on the phalanx eased. The Macedonian center, which had been close to breaking, recovered just enough to reform and push again. This was the real turning point. Alexander did not win simply because he hit harder. He won because in the middle of chaos, he recognized the one place where the battle could still be lost, and he struck there first. With the crisis in the center broken, the path ahead cleared. Now Alexander could refocus on the largest target on the field, Darius himself. Once the center stabilized, Alexander turned his full force forward again. He cut through the resistance in front of him and drove toward the royal position. And that was the moment the battle became psychological. As Alexander and the companion cavalry closed in, Darius III faced the terror of direct collapse. The king of Persia was no longer watching the battle from a safe distance. The storm was coming straight at him. And he broke. Instead of standing and holding the army together, Darius turned his chariot and fled. That single act ripped the nerve out of the Persian army. In a monarchy like Persia, the king was not just a commander. He was the living center of the whole structure. Once he ran, the structure began to come apart. But the danger was not over yet. On the Macedonian left, Armenian was still under crushing pressure from Persian cavalry. If that wing failed before the rest of the Persian line fully collapsed, Alexander could still see victory torn away. The Persians might still roll the field backward, but Armenian held long enough. Then word spread that Darius had fled. That was enough. Persian morale collapsed. Men threw away weapons and trampled each other trying to escape. Order dissolved into slaughter. What had begun as a royal battle line ended as a massacre. And the consequences went far beyond the field. Issus gave Alexander more than a victory. He captured the family of Darius. He broke Persian prestige. He pushed onward into the Western Empire. Phoenician coastal cities began to fall, stripping Persia's navy of the bases it needed to survive. Tyre, after a brutal 7-month siege, was smashed. Gaza fell. Egypt submitted and raised Alexander up as pharaoh. Then came the offer of compromise. Darius, desperate now, offered wealth, his daughter in marriage, and half of his empire for peace. Another king might have accepted that bargain and called it triumph. Alexander refused, because by then the victories had changed the scale of his ambition. He was no longer fighting for position, for survival, or for half measures. He wanted everything. Issus proved something fatal for Persia. Darius could lose even when he had chosen the moment, brought the larger army, and believed he had sealed the trap. From that point on, Alexander was no longer an invader on the edge of empire. He was the force moving to consume the whole thing. And that is how Alexander the Great crushed Persian naval power from the land, turned a perfect trap into a battlefield advantage, and shattered the heart of the Persian Empire at Issus. What stands out more to you? Alexander's battlefield intelligence, or Darius' collapse when the decisive moment finally came? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like and subscribe for more high-stakes military history and tactical analysis. See you in the next video.